Good morning out here in California. I'm Stephen Pfeiffer. I'm a William Perry Research Fellow at Stanford Center on International Security and Cooperation. And I will be moderating today's session of the European Security Initiative. One of the things that the initiative looks at is the kinds of threats, the kinds of security challenges that Russia poses to the United States and Europe. And today we're going to look at the question of information warfare. That has long been a part of Moscow's playbook. When I was in the government back in the 1980s, we talked about Soviet active measures. For example, the effort by the Soviets to get an Italian newspaper to print a story that attributed AIDS to a Department of Defense biological experiment that had gone wrong. Well, Moscow has been very quick to take advantage of modern social media, Twitter, Facebook, because they don't have to find that Italian newspaper. They can put it up on Twitter and have the bots then repeat it and make it a story very quickly. And it's not just been the United States that's been a target of Russian disinformation, as the American intelligence community has confirmed, but also you've had states in Central and Eastern Europe targeted earlier. And today I'm very pleased to host Nina Jankowicz. She is a Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Disinformation Fellow. She's the author of a book, I've got it here, How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News and the Future of Conflict. And it looks at what the Russians have done, not just in the United States, but 5 other case studies. What they've done in Estonia, Georgia, Poland, Ukraine, and the Czech Republic. And it looks how the Russians use disinformation to exploit vulnerabilities and differences within Western societies. It looks like a very interesting read. Ms. Jankowicz is actually a knowledge expert of this field. She's going to be testifying on Thursday before the House Intelligence Committee on Russian disinformation. Before coming to the Woodrow Wilson Center, she was she managed democracy assistance programs at the National Democratic Institute, and she's also advised the government of Ukraine on strategic communications issues. She'll speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have a good half hour for questions. Let me ask you to post your questions on the Q&A format there at the bottom of the bar, and I will try to get to as many questions as we can. Nina, thanks very much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Pfeiffer. I'm really delighted to be with you today. And thanks for that great introduction. I feel like I don't need to add anything, which is kind of rare these days. I will just say that my study of disinformation is comparative. I'm always interested to see how other countries have dealt with this phenomenon before, we even realized that it was a problem. And frankly, I think we have a lot to learn from our allies in Central and Eastern Europe in that regard. But I also look at this as a democracy problem, given my background at NDI. I believe that disinformation, no matter its vector, whether foreign or domestic, no matter what political party it supports or seems to support, in the short term, it is a threat to democracy. And that is something that we have really lost sight of here in the United States. It has become far too political of an issue, and I'll get more into this later, but I think that's the greatest hurdle that we have to clear in responding to disinformation, whether it's a foreign vector or a domestic vector, which I would argue increasingly is what we're dealing with this year. They are really two sides to the same coin, and foreign adversaries really use the domestic vulnerabilities that we have here at home in order to drive discord and dismay and, frankly, disengagement in our democracy. So that's how I see the issue. I had the idea for this book when I was living and working in Ukraine, as you mentioned. I was a Fulbright Public Policy Fellow, which is a program that places mid-career professionals in advisory roles in different countries of foreign policy interest to the United States. And I was lucky enough to be in the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry from 2016 to 2017, working with a really bootstrapped, very dedicated team that was on the front lines of the information war, dealing with an onslaught of false narratives from Russia on a daily basis, and watching how they dealt with disinformation, before we even had these revelations of Russian interference in our election coming up, and then watching how they reacted to those revelations really gave me perspective. Certainly my work at NDI did as well. NDI has always been a target of Russian disinformation. And that's where the idea for the book came from. I saw that, a lot of Western structures were were attempting to reinvent the wheel when it came to countering disinformation. They were creating new structures where perfectly suitable ones already existed. Or, there was what I call the Band-Aid effect, where a new structure was created and all of, the Western world's hopes and dreams were pinned on that structure in that it would solve all of our disinformation problems. And that, sadly, it's not that easy, unfortunately. So that's where the idea from the book came from. And I think I did not know that I was going to be releasing this book during a pandemic, of course, but the lessons that come from our Central and Eastern European allies in this context, I think, are really useful. The ways that they've responded to disinformation, the things that have worked and the things that have not. So I'm going to go through a few of those lessons today. I think they really do ring true for the pandemic. And the first lesson that I learned that I really didn't expect when I set out on this research, having long, in-depth sociological conversations with folks, again, on the front lines of this problem, is that there's a homegrown element to these operations. I alluded to that a little bit earlier. I think what we're seeing now in 2020 is very different to what we saw in 2016 coming from the Russian Federation. And that is because of this increased awareness, especially, the fact that social media platforms are starting to crack down on automated accounts, that's the easy stuff. What Russia and other disinformers have needed to rely on is information laundering. And this was happening in 2016. It just now has become the crux of the operation in 2020. So what do I mean by information laundering? I mean, taking a narrative that belongs, coming from the Kremlin, and laundering it through either an influential figure in American society or through mainstream or legitimate or trusted outlets, press, institutions. So one good example of that we've seen recently is the way conspiracy theories about Ukraine, and in particular, the idea that Ukraine potentially hacked the DNC in order to pin on Russia, the CrowdStrike conspiracy theory, which I have trouble even articulating because it is so outlandish. That made its way, of course, through influential figures in American politics, was laundered into the media, and then eventually aired in the halls of Congress. That is a hallmark of information laundering. But it can also look a little bit different. So in the book, I detail an operation that took place after the 2016 election on July 4th, 2017. And it's a really interesting and kind of personal, tidbit for me. So in my free time, I do a lot of musical theater, or at least I used to before the pandemic. And I remembered when I was living in Ukraine, seeing some ads in July of 2017 for a protest that was going to take place outside of the White House. It was targeting musical theater aficionados. It encouraged everyone to dress up in colonial attire and come and sing songs, parodies from Les Miserables, the musical. And those parodies were, anti-President Trump parodies, revolutionary parodies. And I thought, well, that's funny and cute, and never thought about it again until about a year and a half later, when a criminal complaint in the Russia investigation was unsealed that revealed that those ads had actually been bought by the Internet Research Agency out of St. Petersburg, Russia, on behalf of real activist groups in the United States. And in the book, I interview one of those organizers of one of those activist groups who had no idea he was dealing with somebody from the Russian troll farm. But when he found out, and I was the one who told him, the FBI apparently did not reach out to him about this. When he found out about that, he was just floored. And he said, it really makes sense now, because that was one of our most popular protest actions. And this was not a tiddlywinks group. They had organized, if you remember, the folks who handed out Russian flags at the Conservative Political Action Conference. They unfurled a resist banner at the Nationals home opener that year. They were into these big flashy protest actions. And this one was the one that really garnered a lot of popular support outside of their normal circles. And he really chalked it up to the fact that somebody at the IRA decided to spend $80 to pump this ad out to people in the Washington, D.C. area. I just think it's really interesting because, A, it shows that this isn't just about conservatives, right? We often hear that Russia supported President Trump. It was also targeting liberals in order, again, to create that discord in our society and amplify it. And then the other thing there is that these homegrown actors are often used, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly, by Russia and other adversaries that are trying to launder their narratives and launder that emotion, that discord into our information ecosystem. And this has happened more recently as well. A couple of weeks ago, at the beginning of September, we heard about the Peace Data operation, which was IRA affiliated. And this was an operation that, again, attempted to launder information, slightly altered to the new information environment that we've introduced, again, thanks to the action of social media firms and the awareness of the American public. Those bot networks, troll networks aren't working anymore. So what the Russians did this time was look at a small network of inauthentic accounts that used artificial intelligence generated profile pictures in order to create kind of these false personas that then commissioned articles from real freelance journalists in the United States. So using the cred of those real people, those real freelance journalists in the United States, to give an air of authenticity to the journalism that they were putting up on the Peace Data website, even though it was affiliated, again, with the Internet Research Agency. Another interesting thing that they did is, rather than use a network of inauthentic accounts to amplify all of that, they were using Facebook groups, which I've been sounding the alarm bell on for a couple of years. These are ready-made attack surfaces for any malign actor. Basically, people are segmented by vulnerability, and the algorithm on Facebook allows groups to be recommended to people who are already vulnerable. So for instance, the Peace Data operation, which targeted progressives, used progressive groups, used socialist democratic groups, and used groups that were in favor of, an easy out for Julian Assange, these sorts of things, and dropped their links in there. Now, luckily, the FBI caught this and tipped off the social media platforms before it got too popular. But that group structure, and I've written about this extensively, if you look up a recent article I wrote with Cindy Otis, a former CIA analyst in Wired, the way these groups work basically incentivizes that emotional content. And that's the sort of laundering that we're seeing today, not the inauthentic networks of yesteryear. So that's number one. Again, there's a homegrown element to these operations. Russia is very good at tapping into that. And that comes through from the case studies as well. If you look at Estonia, certainly there were homegrown elements to the ethnic Russian, ethnic Estonian conflict in 2007. There are similar elements in the continued issues in Georgia, which tap into Orthodox Christian and cultural networks in Georgia, to exact Russian influence. And similar things are happening in Poland as well, where those intrinsic, societal fissures are being exploited by Russia in Poland in order to launder those narratives, because Poles are very, attuned to Russian tactics, especially. So that's point number one. Number two, it really comes through in all of the countries that have been successful in countering disinformation, that there needs to be a human element to those programs. Too often we really keep the response to disinformation in the national security community. And it absolutely is a national security issue. But again, what our adversaries are exploiting are real grievances, real fissures in society. So I mentioned Estonia a little bit before. I count Estonia as one of the best in terms of responding to disinformation. And that is in part because their response is holistic. Yes, they have upped their cyber defenses, but they've also invested in integrating the Russian population, answering the grievances that Russia was able to play on in 2007 to instigate riots about, integration of Russian nationals and gray passport holders in Estonia as Estonia was, making its entree as one of the tech hubs of the European Union. And they've also invested in things like media literacy, educational opportunities for the Russian population. There is a Russian language outpost of Tartu University in Narva that is a real opportunity for many Russian speakers, because until this was established, there weren't opportunities for really fulsome degree programs in Russian language that were respected. You could basically buy your degree at a private university, but there weren't those university opportunities for Russian speakers until this was established. So that's one of the investments they've made. Russian language media have been invested in. And if you look at the integration statistics since 2007, there's really an uptick in terms of Russian speakers, ethnic Russian individuals who are really embracing that Estonian identity, who have fewer grievances about what's going on in the country and their role in it. And no longer do they feel that de facto segregation that is really on the downturn. And I think that we could truly learn from Estonia in that regard. Of course, Estonia is only 1.3 million people, but if a plucky country like Estonia can do it, then certainly the United States should be investing in some of those same generational solutions. And I often encounter some resistance when folks hear about media or digital literacy. They say, you know, those are long-term programs, we can invest in them later, but we have to solve, you know, the big problems now. And yes, I understand that to some degree, but we've already squandered at least 4 years not investing in these programs, which shouldn't be partisan in any way, right? Everyone wants more informed voters, more informed democratic citizens. And that's the sort of thing that we've got to do. That human part of the equation needs to be there. Of course, some of this is about good governance, right? We actually need responsive government in order to deal with the issues that Russia is, you know, amplifying and exploiting, like racism, like economic inequality, like those hot button political issues. We need to find solutions to them. But in the interim, I hope that we can give our citizens the tools they need to navigate the information environment and understand why and when they might be being exploited. And then finally, and I previewed this a little bit before, we cannot counter disinformation when we embrace its tactics ourselves. And this is something that I thought this book was purely going to be about, foreign disinformation. And as it unfolded and the interviews happened, it became clear that this was a real hurdle, not only here in the United States, but also in several of our allied countries. So I'll start with Poland. Poland, as I mentioned before, there's no rose-colored glasses about what Russia is capable of there. In fact, when you talk to many Poles, they will tell you, oh, we're inoculated against Russian disinformation and propaganda. We've been vaccinated against it. There's nothing we need to really do. But if you look at the Polish press, if you look at even the state-run media, if you look at the narratives that the Law and Justice Party is spreading, many of them dovetail almost exactly with some of the narratives that are in Sputnik Poland, for instance. They are homophobic narratives. They are anti-Ukraine narratives. Now that visa-free travel has started, Russia has in particular been kind of poking the historical dragon between Poland and Ukraine and issues from World War II in particular. And in general, they are anti-EU, anti-NATO. And I don't think that is a coincidence. Again, there is a lot of this information laundering happening. But Russia is also able to exploit the deterioration of the Polish information environment. So you have the Law and Justice Party, for instance, taking control of the state-run media, taking control of the judiciary, outlawing certain forms of protest. You have also the Law and Justice Party using many of the same tactics that Russia itself uses. There's a couple of great investigations by The Guardian in particular, the reporter Christian Davies out of Warsaw, who looks at the troll and bot farms that Law and Justice has used that look very similar to the tactics that Russia is using. And the Oxford Internet Institute as well looked at issues, I think, around the presidential election in Poland that were very similar, again, to Russian tactics. So there's a bit of a pot calling the kettle black scenario, because on the one hand, in Polish national security doctrine, you see that Russia is a threat, that they are investing in their Ministry of Defense, in the Chancellery of the Prime Minister, in their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in all of this counter-disinformation work. They even have a Ministry of Digitalization. I interviewed that minister. I was surprised he was going to talk to me, frankly, because I'm pretty, critical of the Law and Justice government. But he met with me, to his credit, and everything he said made a lot of sense. You know, they're looking at media literacy. They had a safe elections kind of voter education push ahead of their local and parliamentary elections. But again, one of their main thrusts was making sure that conservative voices on the internet were not being silenced by the social media platforms. And that was one of his main issues in terms of his portfolio, not necessarily disinformation. So not understanding that perhaps those conservative voices were being chastised on the platforms because they were breaking terms of service. In Georgia, things look a little bit different. So again, a country that really has a full understanding of what Russia is capable of. What's interesting about Georgia is they had a fairly robust counter-Russia disinformation policy during the UNM government under Mikhail Saakashvili. When UNM was voted out and Georgian Dream came in, a lot of that was undone. So a lot of the Russian language news that they put out and minority language and Azeri and Armenian to counter Russian disinformation at those minority populations, those programs were ended. And vectors of offline influence were opened up for the Russian government as well through economic ties, through media ownership, through, frankly, the cultural organizations and religious organizations that, have Russian-Georgian ties. So I was in Georgia last summer in June 2019 when the protests broke out because a member of the Russian parliament who was at the Interparliamentary Orthodox conference that was taking place in Tbilisi sat in the chair of the Georgian Speaker of Parliament. And of course, all of Tbilisi immediately came out to the streets because they were so shocked. But that sort of soft influence is what Russia has increasingly started to use in Georgia. And it's how they fund a lot of the kind of shady narratives that are making their way through Georgian media into the mainstream. And again, look at their national security policy. There is great stuff happening in the Georgian Ministry of Defense, but on the other hand, you have this tacit endorsement of disinformation, not only coming from the ruling party. In my book, I describe how they've taken over one of the opposition media channels there, Rustavi 2, but also through their lack of attention to these soft vectors of influence, which support the greater online information ecosystem as well. And I think both of those examples should sound really familiar to American listeners right now because we're seeing a very similar kind of bifurcated policy here in the United States. I think the United States has done some good things in our government to counter disinformation, particularly in the part of the world that I study. But we are turning a blind eye to disinformation that is spreading domestically. And frankly, what Russia and our adversaries have to do this election season is very little. They can sit back and watch the polarization happen. They can sit back and just amplify false narratives that are being put out there by our own politicians. And we really need to disincentivize that sort of behavior, either through regulation of the social media platforms, of campaigns and what is allowed in our political campaigning, but also at the ballot box. So that's where I stand today. This work is really, I think, incredibly important, and I'm trying to reach as many audiences as possible. So I'm very appreciative that you gave me your time today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Terrific. That was a great opening presentation. Let me pose one question, then I'll open it up to Q's and A's. Again, if audience members have questions, please type it in a Q&A, and I will try to get to as many as possible. But I guess my question would be is, so looking at today compared to 2016, and as you mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of awareness about what the Russians were doing. There's been some exposure of specific Russian disinformation efforts. You talk about they've had to sort of shift their tactics more towards laundering disinformation and really focusing on exploiting American divisions, of which there are unfortunately a lot. Would you have any kind of estimate of how effective, I mean, what the impact is that the Russians are having now compared to 2016? Is it less effective? Is it about the same? Or is it sort of overwhelmed just by our domestic disinformation efforts?
I would say probably the last option there. I think the domestic efforts are overshadowing anything a foreign adversary could do. And without getting too political, and this is not from a political point of view, it's from a point of view of somebody who served as an election observer in multiple countries and used to do democracy support work. The idea that the president would be casting doubt on the integrity of our election processes for so long, I mean, this has been since May or June, over and over and over again, that is a disinformer's dream, no matter where you're coming from. And I think that's what we've seen echoed in a lot of the overt Russian disinformation that we're able to track in RT, in Sputnik. Certainly, the protests over the summer, the Black Lives Matter protests were something that the overt Russian propaganda certainly seized on, looking at the whataboutism there. So again, it's more about reflecting what's actually going on here. And we've given them, again, plenty of fuel. I'd also say that this was presaged a little bit in Ukraine in 2019, where another very contentious presidential election happened. Everyone was there looking for signs of Russian disinformation. And I was there on a Pulitzer Center grant reporting on the steps the government was taking and how the disinformation environment was shaping up ahead of that vote. And it was very similar, where you just had so much rancor between the Poroshenko and Zelensky camps that Russia didn't really need to do very much. Now, of course, they didn't try. They were trying to exploit the loopholes that did exist. One of the things that they did was try to rent Facebook accounts from individuals so that they could get around the geographic ad restrictions. We've seen a little bit of that here in the United States, but I think Facebook is more attuned to it here in the US. And they've also recently tried to establish a bot farm in Ukraine. So they used a lot of Ukrainian and European SIM cards, I think to the tune of 40,000 or so, spread out across several different cities in Ukraine, so that they could, again, tap into and create a bot network that would convincingly look European instead of being from Russia. So I think, they're adapting. But that being said, they don't have to be as creative as they did in 2016 in terms of creating content. And even a super successful Russian disinformation campaign is not going to get the pickup and amplification that something that comes from the President of the United States does.
Okay, great, thank you. Let me give you a question from Herb Lynn, who asks, you made the claim with the statement that there's a bipartisan desire for all voters to be better informed. And he asked, why do you believe that?
Thank you, Herb. Thanks for coming. And I have recently cited one of your excellent papers in a publication of mine for the Parameters U.S. Army War College Journal. Why do I believe that? I guess I'm still an optimist about our government and and the function that it is supposed to serve. Also, from my experience at the Wilson Center, I will say, although the folks in the GOP don't seem to want to talk about these issues publicly, in private, I've briefed them on multiple occasions. I've also served as a Republican witness in a few hearings. I think they do care about this, and I'm hopeful that if there is a change in political will, that we will begin to see those investments toward a more informed public. And one thing I didn't mention that I'm very passionate about is the fact that we need to invest more in media as a public good here in the United States. And I know that's anathema to many people who hate the idea of big government and government involved in their media. But the fact is, we only spend $1.35 per person per year on our Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I think we can up that and really, make sure that folks in news deserts who rely on PBS and NPR for local news coverage are informed and have a lifeline to the news. And I think, that should be something that gets bipartisan support. And I hope that in the future, there's a little bit more traction for that. But perhaps I'm too optimistic. I do recognize that. I wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning if I weren't, though.
Great, thank you. Let me ask a question posed by Michael May, who asks, Estonia's holistic response was orchestrated by the Estonian government. Can you tell us, does the United States government have an organization that could also mount that kind of holistic response, which is probably going to be necessary because private platforms like Facebook are not in a position to do that job?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is part of the problem of the politicization of this topic and the lack of desire and political will from the Trump administration to really address it and prioritize it head on. There are a couple of good nodes in the federal government that are dealing with these issues. So we have the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency at DHS, which is dealing with issues of election security in particular. They're a small but robust team that is doing good work. I'm sorry, my dog just jumped up onto the bed where the camera is. So if you see it moving around, that is why. They do good work, but they need more funding. They need more resources, human and monetary. The Global Engagement Center at the State Department is supposed to be the coordinating function for the national security community. Unfortunately, they had a rocky start and took a long time to get their funding, again, because of that politicization issue. I have qualms about some of the ways that they approach their work, and they are focused entirely on operations abroad because of where their funding comes from. They cannot message at all to the American people, which is fine given where they sit in the government. But in terms of that coordinating function, I think we need to think much bigger than that. And actually, to go back to Herb's paper, he's got a very good kind of outline of all of the areas of the federal government that deal even a little bit with disinformation. So I suggest you take a look at that. But then we've also got the DoD, which is involved in some of these issues, again, looking more abroad, not at the American people. What we lack is a real central node in terms of coordinating function. A lot of our allies have created that node either in the equivalent of their National Security Council or the cabinet, sometimes in the Prime Minister's office. It's important that that exists because it keeps the issue on the agenda. It has convening power to get the entire interagency together on this issue. And it also has the power to reach outside of the traditional national security community, which I think is extremely important. We need the Department of Education involved. We need our libraries involved. We need our Endowment for the Humanities involved. We need essentially, you know, the arms of government that actually deal with Americans involved in this issue. And so far that has not happened. That is on the policy side. I also am strongly in favor of, and this is, you know, my own regulatory approach. I will have a paper coming out with the Wilson Center in a couple of weeks that looks kind of comparatively at different regulatory approaches for social media around the world. But I really think that we need to look at reestablishing the Office of Technology Assessment on the Hill. The fact that they are kind of flying blind and relying on the youngest people in the office to inform them about policy decisions that they're making is problematic at best. But B, I would be in favor of Congress establishing an expert oversight and transparency body to look at the things that social media platforms are doing, and make sure, again, I don't want anybody to have a button to say yes or no, leave up a post or take it down. I don't think that's the government's role. But I do want to know that social media platforms are doing right by their users. And just as a personal aside, I've been dealing with a lot of trolling lately on my Twitter account, domestically, and I've always dealt with Russian trolls. But the extent to which I have absolutely no visibility about what is happening policy-wise when I send those reports in, I mean, that's an example of platforms really not protecting their users. And those threats can easily double over into violence, as we've seen recently with Gretchen Whitmer and the militia kidnapping plot that was just unfurled last week. So I think there's a role there for that oversight and compliance. Obviously, we need regulations to go along with that as well. So I'm hopeful that'll happen in the next Congress.
Okay, a question from David Elliott. Do you have ways, or can you assess the success of U.S. offensive actions in the information world, and how do they impact or perhaps limit our defensive efforts?
Right. So we are a little bit hindered, I would say, by the fact that we are democratic, open, and transparent. So the offensive measures that we have taken in the information sphere all are stamped with, you know, a giant U.S. government seal, and that's how they should be. Frankly, we don't want to go masquerading around pretending to be Russians or a local population anywhere else. I am not in favor of that whatsoever. That being said, you know, I think investments like Radio Free Europe and Voice of America have yielded dividends. That is why they are targets in the societies that they exist in. In particular, I've relied on RFE and their reporting in Georgia and more recently in Belarus. They are truly a lifeline. And again, they've been targets for the good reporting that they do there. I think that sort of investment is extremely important. Again, I know some people will roll their eyes at this, but I feel an obligation to say it as an alumnus of the Fulbright program and several other exchanges. I think that is a great way to exercise US soft power, and the return on investment is huge. To see those programs from the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs being slashed every year by the Trump administration is very scary to me, as is the politicization of USAGM, the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Those are the things that I think are working right now. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. We should keep you know, supporting those agencies. On the other hand, we've also had some offensive cyber attacks and cyber kind of forays, I guess you would call them. One just came out yesterday that was done both by Cybercom at DoD and the folks at Microsoft who were both taking down a Russian hacking ring at once. We also had the Internet Research Agency taken offline in 2018, just before the midterm election. I think these are good as signals. The only problem that I have with them, and problem is a strong word, perhaps criticism, is that I'd like to see more of this happening outside of election periods, right? Disinformation campaigns are not just things that happen right around voting day. That's not how it works. We know that the foundations for them are laid for many years ahead of time. I would say that Russia has been working on this since 2013 or 2014, and they've not stopped, despite all the attention that's been paid to them since 2016. So we need to be sending those signals that this is a possibility long before and outside of election day. Election is an inflection point. It's not an end point. And I would like to see a little bit more aggression, I think is the right word, in terms of cyber criminals, frankly, in the offensive space, to send that message and kind of draw a line, because clearly, you know, the other punitive measures that we put into place, things like sanctions, aren't really working in that regard. But other than that, I would say it's really important that the United States always stand by democratic values and transparency in these issues. Again, I don't want to mimic Russian tactics. Our moral high ground is our best weapon, in my opinion.
Okay, great. Well, let me take two questions and combine them from Gregory McCallum and Frank Rettenberg. Given your stance that the US populace should be privy to how Russia manipulates information here, how do we reach people who believe the QAnon and other conspiracy nonsense and false narratives? And then related to that is, do you see any links between the Russians and domestic conspiracy theorist groups like QAnon? Are the Russians trying to exploit those groups as sort of maybe useful idiots?
Yeah, they're absolutely trying to exploit them. I will say categorically that I do not believe QAnon is a Russian creation. This is something that is uniquely American in its provenance, I think. But it has come up a lot in Russian disinformation narratives. How do we reach those people is definitely a difficult question. I think one of the most important things is leading by example, which we've not seen this administration or frankly some of our elected officials do. I firmly agree with the resolution that was recently passed that was condemning QAnon in the House. I'd like to see a little bit more of that coming from elected officials, because it's not just the content of this conspiracy theory that makes it repugnant. It is the fact that it has led to violence on multiple occasions, and that should be enough for our elected officials to condemn it under no uncertain terms. How do we reach them? I actually have in my extended family someone who has become an adherent of this theory. So I've done some reading up on how to reach people on this. The violence issue does seem to be one that resonates with people. Some people, especially now during the pandemic, well, everybody's online a lot. Everybody's searching for answers, right? Or when am I going to go back to work? When are my kids going to go back to school? Am I going to maintain my job? How do I keep myself and my family safe? So conspiracy theories hold a special allure during these times. And I think that's why we're seeing an uptick in them. And people don't necessarily connect the dots between this crazy thing that they're reading online or watching YouTube videos about and its real world effects. And so it hasn't worked in my case, full disclosure, but what other folks, and there's a message board on Reddit called, I forget what the name of it is. It's something to do with QAnon and families, but there's a whole message board about people who are trying to talk to their families about it and really coming at it from an inquisitive point of view, not making it an intervention, saying, I'm interested in learning more about why you think this is true. And this holds true for any conspiracy theory or piece of dis and misinformation, by the way. Rather than just fact checking people outright, it's best to try to have that conversation and draw out their views so you can respond to them in a more human way, and also say, I hear your concerns, I hear what you're saying, here's what the reporting says, here's what I've read that's been interesting to me. And that's when you can bring up the fact that this movement has endangered people's lives, and there's a whole list of instances where QAnon has actually caused violence. And for some people that will, shake them out of it. But again, with any of these things, I think the best thing to do is have a private conversation. Often I see folks trying to duke it out in the comments, either in a Twitter thread or on Facebook comments, and people are going to stand their ground when they're attacked publicly. So just keep that in mind. Come at it from a human and a loving point of view. And I think you'll at least make a little more progress there than if you try to do that publicly.
Okay. Dylan Junkin asked, how do states learn from one another's influence operations and disinformation efforts? And specifically, will China and Russia, will the strategies and tactics they use converge over time?
So there are a few people who think that Russia's and China's tactics are already converging. I'm a little bit more hesitant to make that declaration so far based on what we've seen, because, and with the full disclosure that I do not speak Chinese, so I don't have the same depth of knowledge that I do with Russia. From what I've seen, Russia is, as I mentioned before, doing this, attempts to do and build discord as much as possible. It's operating on all sides of the political spectrum, sometimes actively funding and supporting movements that go directly against one another. What we've seen so far from China in the disinformation space is a more typical sort of propaganda that aims to paint China in a positive light. It is motivated by political ideology. In some cases, as with the Hong Kong protests, it was a fairly clumsy narrative that, again, attempted to paint this positive picture of China and denigrate the Hong Kong protesters, and was using, again, not the most sophisticated tactics in terms of bot and troll networks, like easily spottable disinformation. So I think, does China have the capability to do this? Absolutely. It's one of the things that they do domestically. And I do fear the day when the Tencent army is unleashed on the rest of the world, because that will be it'll be a very difficult thing to combat just in terms of sheer numbers, and the way that would be able to flood the zone. But I don't put it past any of our adversaries to learn the tactics that we're seeing coming from Russia. In fact, we're seeing them replicated on a much smaller scale, and again, to a less high level of sophistication in places like Venezuela and Iran also. Okay.
Craig Falkenhagen first says, thank you very much for a worthwhile and illuminating presentation. And he says he sometimes often refers to a media bias chart, which is maintained by Adfontes Media Incorporated to engage the political bias and accuracy of various media outlets. And yes, do you have a take on how reliable that chart is? I mean, and how reliable their assessments are?
So I've seen a couple of those charts floating around. I'm not sure I'm familiar with that one in particular. But in general, I think the healthy thing to do in this news environment, especially to add a little bit of civility to discussions with people who might have different beliefs than you, is to kind of have a buffet that you consume of news, so you understand how things are being portrayed and described across the spectrum. And frankly, there are always going to be one or two North Stars that people have in their news diet, and those will be the kind of core. But I think the charts like that are fine. Your gut is probably the best instinct that you could have. And just, again, grazing from all of them will give you a better view than, those media bias charts. I have seen them used in a way that I would consider malign by certain partisan organizations. So just be aware of that as well. And if you're getting a chart like that and really relying on it, make sure it's from a nonpartisan source. But it sounds like you're being very deliberate about your news consumption anyway. So I think you're okay.
Let me ask, this comes from Eric Del Rosario. Does Russia typically use efforts in Central and Eastern Europe to sort of test and perfect tactics, which they then try elsewhere? And then if so, have you seen them use in any of those countries the deep fake videos?
So to the first question, yes, and the book in more detail than I was able to go into in 20 minutes goes into that. Certainly, Ukraine has been a laboratory for testing of Russian disinformation and cyber techniques. And in fact, that's why, the information laundering piece that has become so critical in this election was not so surprising to me, because it was happening already in Ukraine in 2019, and to some extent a little bit in the midterm elections. But the techniques and tools have definitely been tried and tested, and Central and Eastern Europe is a laboratory. One of the other great examples from the book is the referendum that happened about Ukraine's association agreement with the EU in the Netherlands in 2016, which I think a lot of the tools and tactics there were then deployed in the Brexit referendum, from what we've seen. Have they used deepfakes yet? I have not seen use of deepfakes by a foreign adversary. The only real use of deepfakes I've seen has been here in the United States, and I wouldn't even call them deepfakes. They're just, misleadingly manipulated videos. I'm thinking, for instance, of the video of Nancy Pelosi, or the altercation that happened at one press briefing that appeared to show a news reporter pushing a White House press aide that was also manipulated, as I recall. Those aren't even deep fakes to the extent that, we could create a video or audio of a leader speaking or saying or doing something that might be newsworthy. These were just altered, manipulated images. So I think, unfortunately, that bridge we have not yet crossed. I am worried about when we do cross it, but I'm also a little more optimistic than I am about just the sort of cheap fakes that we continue to see. So memes and copy and pasted information that's making its way around Facebook, things like that. Because there are a lot of smart people who are already working on the deepfakes issue proactively. I think DARPA is working on it. There's an initiative out of Adobe who's working with Twitter and the New York Times called the Content Authenticity Initiative, that would allow users to explore how an image or video has been changed and edited over time. And I'm pretty optimistic about that working. I think the fact that we're thinking about it ahead of time, again, is miles ahead of where we were just thinking about the basic dis and misinformation that we're dealing with today. But another question is, how we deal with elected officials, frankly, who are sharing these manipulated media now to this day. The fact that they're embracing them and sharing them with such alacrity. There's always going to be editing, but where's the line that is okay for political campaigns and political candidates to engage in that sort of stuff? I'd like to see more leaders taking pledges against sharing disinformation, hack materials, and manipulated media in the future, because again, we need to disincentivize this sort of behavior. But we haven't quite crossed the deepfake bridge yet. So I remain hopeful, but again, perhaps too optimistic.
Okay. Let me just ask briefly on some of the tactics that you've seen the Russians use in Central and Eastern Europe. Is there an effort by those countries to sort of share their strategies, particularly counter strategies that succeeded? And is there a mechanism really for the US government to sort of take advantage of learning that's already gone on there, and perhaps more broadly between Central and Eastern European countries and other Russian targets such as Germany, France, Britain?
Yeah, I wish there were more coordinated sharing mechanisms happening. So there is a group chaired by the UK that aims to kind of tease out some of that knowledge. I think a lot of, especially our friends in the Baltics, would tell you that they were trying to warn us about this for many years and we didn't listen. So there's a little bit of, exhaustion there, I would say. I will be honest and say that I think there is room for the United States to lead and create that sort of information sharing mechanism. There is a G7 rapid response mechanism about disinformation, but As I understand it, it is kind of a glorified mailing list, and we need something that's a little bit more robust to deal with this challenge. And again, there are a couple of different working groups, a Friends of Ukraine working group that deals in particular with a lot of disinformation issues and strategic communications issues. There are NATO centers of excellence, one in Tallinn that deals with cyber issues, one in Riga that deals with strategic communications. The United States is not a member of the Stratcom COE for reasons that I do not understand. And we've also got a EU-NATO joint center of excellence that deals with hybrid issues in Helsinki. So those are all fora through which these issues are discussed, but I would like to see something a little bit more robust, a little bit more regular, and again, something that perhaps prioritizes the experiences of our allies abroad. I think that would be a worthwhile investment.
Okay. John Fowler asks, if the US government were to invest more into the media ecosystem, how would you suggest we stay clear of the risk of a political party then trying actually to take over that media and use it for its own political purposes, as we've seen happen both in Turkey and in Poland?
Yeah, I mean, I just hope that wouldn't happen in the United States. The CPB has been really good about maintaining editorial independence, but we've also seen, as I mentioned earlier, the overtaking of USAGM for political purposes in the past couple of months. So we just need to make sure that those firewalls exist and are respected. I think, PBS and NPR have a good reputation of delivering editorially independent, factually based information, and that firewall needs to continue to exist. There cannot be hirings and firings that are dictated by political appointees. These, investments should be led by experts, by respected journalists, not by folks who are the political gophers of an administration, one or another. And I think that's what we've seen in Poland. Of course, there was a new appointee who came in and fired everyone. I like to think that we have enough of a firewall here that wouldn't happen. Some of those journalists left of their own accord because they didn't like the new editorial policies. But I think from what we've seen in the response from Congress related to USAGM in particular, I'm confident that there would be enough of an outcry and enough of a check and balance on the functioning of those outlets that we wouldn't let that happen to the extent that it's happened in Turkey, Poland, Georgia, et cetera.
Okay. Dylan Farrell asks, and noting the difference that you described between how Russia uses its information operations to sow and basically broaden discord within the United States, whereas China seems more focused on promoting a positive image of China. But the question is, do the economic interests that China has in the US and the West perhaps limit its desire to engage in the kind of tactics that the Russians pursue? And given the fact that, in the case of Russia, there's, much less of an economic relationship, probably maybe 1/20th of that between the United States and China. So does that have a moderated influence on what the Chinese do?
Yeah, I think that's very possible. I mean, I will say I am much less aware of the Chinese disinformation apparatus compared to the Russian one, so I can't explain in great detail. I would direct you to my colleague at the Wilson Center, Ray Zhang, who is a specialist on Chinese disinformation. She's great, but I think that sounds very plausible to me. That being said, we're seeing Chinese cyber attacks on the uptick ahead of the election, and you wonder, is that attempting to exert influence over President Trump while in the remainder of his first term? What's the idea there? Is it trying to curry favor with the Trump administration because China appears to be attacking Vice President Biden? We're not sure. But certainly, the things that could have a huge effect, not necessarily in the informational sphere, but in the cyber sphere, are that threat is real coming from China right now, even if they're not dabbling as much in disinformation itself.
Okay. Dan Zhukov asks, regarding the misleading and manipulated videos that we mentioned, A Russian disinformation campaign has been spreading this kind of content through legally established organizations such as Rupli, an arm of RT, and the RT network. Are there possible ways that you could regulate against those tactics, considering that this is the inherent legality of the method that the Russians are using?
Yeah, so I think this gets kind of complicated. I was against the very direct action we took against RT and Sputnik in terms of forcing them to register as foreign agents. If we're going to be robust about our execution and implementation of FARA overall, I think that would have been okay, but singling out RT and Sputnik kind of gave them this illustrious air that they frankly don't deserve, because the impact of RT and Sputnik is very low. It's interesting that you mentioned Rupli and some of the other RT subsidiaries. Redfish, I think, is another one of them that are popular among progressives, especially socialist progressives. They're kind of these meme-like videos that are often shared on things like Twitter and some of the other social media platforms. That is a fascinating question to me. And now they've been labeled with Russian state-sponsored media. I would be interested to hear from Twitter how that's affecting engagement with their content. I don't think we've heard anything about that yet. I think labeling them is great because they do try to escape that association with RT. And frankly, RT tries to escape association with RT. That's why they rebranded as RT and not Russia Today, right? So I think all of that is important. But, unless we had a law that was similar to the fairness doctrine, perhaps, that was, nixed by the Reagan administration, that dealt with all US media and their ability to traffic in those sorts of materials, manipulated, et cetera, or otherwise unfair, I don't think it would be something that could just apply to foreign media, because what we've seen in the FARA regulations being slapped on RT and Sputnik is that we have had accreditation taken away from some American reporters in Moscow. And I think that whataboutism is always going to be a question. So again, our openness is our strength here. And if we're going to have a regulation like that, it needs to apply equally to American media as well, which I don't frankly see happening. I don't see that getting through Congress anytime soon.
Okay. We've talked about Russia and Chinese operations against the United States. What would be sort of the next tier of countries that you would say the United States should be worried about in terms of hostile disinformation campaigns here?
Well, I think there's been a very concerted campaign to undermine the cohesion and integrity of the European Union. We've seen Russian interference in the Brexit referendum. We've seen Russian disinformation targeting Germany in particular with regard to the migrant crisis in particular. And we've seen countries where there are NATO troops deployed, including through enhanced forward presence, so the Baltics, Poland, Romania, also being targeted with a lot of disinformation from the Russians about NATO troops. Things like NATO troops are impregnating local women, or there was a huge accident with a weapons depot, or a NATO military member was in a pub and got drunk and beat somebody up. That's the sort of thing we're seeing a lot, again, to undermine the integrity of these Western political structures. But, there are a lot of areas where, with a less robust democratic system, it's much easier to seed this sort of disinformation. So there's a lot happening in Central Asia in this regard. I think Russia and China were both extremely active in Africa during the beginning of the coronavirus crisis. And that wasn't even disinformation. It was just good old, mask aid and things like that, that send a good political message on their behalf. And where they have those strong relationships with aid and things like that is where Russian influence is able to really get in, because nobody bats an eye, right? Russia's an ally, Russia's supporting us, Russia's helping us get through this difficult medical crisis, this difficult economic era. Russia builds churches or mosques where we are. I think that's the sort of thing that we need to worry about. It's, again, that influence package is much broader, and it's not necessarily going to be online. So it could be anywhere, frankly, but there's been a lot in particular targeting the EU and NATO as institutions. And we need to, and this is something that Peter Pomerantsev has said, and also leaves me somewhat optimistic in a conversation that can be very depressing. That can be our strength as we, try to really lean into solving this problem, doing it together with our allies, building on the strengths of our relationships, building on the strength of our morals and values, joining together not only to create policy solutions in the legislative realm, because that regulation will be much stronger if it's coming from 30 or 40 nations than just one, but also, establishing those costs for our adversaries to make certain that, that they will be met with either economic or other potential costs. We talked about cyber attacks before, from a bloc as a whole, rather than just one nation responding. Because if you do that against, not to pick on Lithuania, but Lithuania, if you do that against Lithuania, it's going to be one thing. But if the entire EU is behind, a response to an adversary that has crossed a digital line, then things start to look a little bit different.
Okay. At the risk of running over just about 1 minute, I just want to pose one question for some career advice. This comes from DT Hiremouth, who's a high school senior, and wondering how you would recommend getting into the field of cyber information policy, especially the issues that you've been dealing with and talking about for the United States and Central and Eastern Europe.
So I answered this question for a podcast earlier today as well, and my own career path has been somewhat circuitous and serendipitous. The thing that I think is important is just following your academic intellectual interests. So it was my interest in Russia that brought me to this path, that brought me to Ukraine eventually. But also, while I was working at NDI, I was very interested in communications and social media, which also led me in that direction. So just follow your gut and try to find ways in, the experiences that you find yourself in to bring out the things that you're interested in. Find those little connective tissues, because that's where the really interesting work happens. That's how I've found it. And don't say no to stuff when you're young. Just say yes. Try to be creative and energetic, and that'll get you 90% of the way there.
Great. Well, thank you. Unfortunately, I think we have to wrap it up at this point. Were we meeting around the conference table in the Perry Conference Room in Encina Hall? This is where I would invite a round of applause. I'm sure it would be loud and sustained. We can't really have a way to do that on Zoom, but thank you very much for a great conversation. We very much appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, Ambassador Piper. Thanks for having me.